The year is 1774, and the air in London is thick with the scent of coal smoke and damp wool, a perpetual gray haze clinging to the city. Deep inside St. James's Palace, the rooms are lit by the flickering golden light of countless candles, their warmth doing little to penetrate the chilly stone walls. In a quiet, ornate chamber, an immense mahogany table groans under the weight of maps, dispatches, and stacks of documents tied with ribbon. At the head of this table sits a solitary figure, not a king in a glittering crown, but a man named King George III. He is in his late 30s, his eyes tired but sharp, his hands resting on the papers before him. He reads a report, his face a mask of weary resolve. The dispatches from the American colonies speak of defiance, of protests, of tea being tossed into a harbor, and of assemblies meeting in open rebellion against the crown. The king's advisers, men in powdered wigs and silk coats, stand at a respectful distance, their whispers hushed and tense. The fate of an empire, stretching from the frozen tundras of Canada to the sun-drenched shores of the Caribbean, hangs on the decisions made in this quiet room. The king knows this. He also knows that a rebellion, once ignited, is a fire that can spread uncontrollably. He looks at a map of the American colonies, his fingers tracing the coastlines from Massachusetts Bay down to the Carolinas. Did you know this was the moment when the last hope for a peaceful resolution began to fade, as decisions made here in London set the stage for a conflict that would change the world forever? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is, and we can all drift off together. The American Revolutionary War didn't truly begin with a single shot, but was a slow, simmering conflict that had been brewing for over a decade. The seeds of discontent were planted long before the first battle, growing from the very soil of the colony's relationship with Great Britain. For much of the 18th century, the American colonies had enjoyed a period of what historians call salutary neglect. It was an unofficial British policy of avoiding strict enforcement of parliamentary laws as long as the colonies remained loyal to the British government and contributed to the economic prosperity of Britain. This hands-off approach allowed the colonies to develop their own systems of self-governance, their own economies, and a sense of independent identity. They were still British subjects, of course, but they were also developing into something distinctly American. However, the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, changed everything. Great Britain emerged victorious, but deeply in debt. They felt it was only fair that the American colonists, who had benefited greatly from the British protection against the French, should help pay for the cost of their own defense. This logic, while sound in London, did not sit well in the colonies. They had contributed to the war effort, both with men and resources, and they felt their sacrifices were being ignored. So Parliament began to pass a series of new acts and taxes designed to raise revenue from the colonies, shattering the old policy of neglect. First came the Sugar Act of 1764, which was a sort of tax on molasses that they hoped would curb smuggling, but which instead just annoyed a lot of people who liked their molasses cheap. Then came the Stamp Act in 1765, which was a tax on almost every piece of printed paper, from legal documents to playing cards. This one really got people fired up. The colonists argued that they should not be taxed without their consent, a principle they summed up with the famous phrase, "No taxation without representation." They didn't have any representatives in the British Parliament, so they felt these taxes were a violation of their rights as Englishmen. The colonists responded with boycotts of British goods, and the protests became more organized and widespread. The British government eventually repealed the Stamp Act, but they followed up with the Declaratory Act, which basically said, "We repealed the tax, but we still have the right to tax you anytime we want to." It was a classic, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed" move that nobody was really buying. More taxes followed, including the Townshend Acts on things like glass, lead, paper, and tea. This led to more protests, and tensions continued to escalate. One of the most famous events, of course, was the Boston Massacre in 1770, where British soldiers fired on a crowd of colonists, killing 5 of them. It was a tragic incident that was used by propagandists on both sides to stir up strong emotions. The British tried to calm things down, but their efforts were often clumsy and counterproductive. The Tea Act of 1773 was intended to help the struggling British East India Company by giving it a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies, which actually made the tea cheaper. But the colonists saw it as another trick to force them to accept the principle of taxation. They responded with the Boston Tea Party, where a group of colonists disguised as Native Americans dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. The British government was furious. They responded with a series of harsh laws called the Coercive Acts, which the colonists quickly dubbed the Intolerable Acts. These acts closed Boston Harbor until the tea was paid for, restricted local government in Massachusetts, and allowed British officials to be tried in Britain instead of the colonies. It also put more British troops in Boston. This was the final straw. The other colonies saw these acts not as a punishment for Massachusetts alone, but as a threat to their own liberties. They began to organize, sending delegates to the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774. This was a crucial moment, as the colonies, for the first time, began to act as a unified body. They agreed on a boycott of all British goods and sent a petition to King George III, hoping to find a peaceful resolution. But the king and Parliament saw this as an act of rebellion. The time for peaceful solutions was over. Both sides began to prepare for the inevitable conflict, stockpiling weapons and drilling their militias. The British sent more troops to Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage, with orders to suppress the rebellion. A mainstream historical fact is that the British government at this point still believed that the rebellion was limited to a few radical leaders, and that the majority of the colonists were loyal to the crown. They were about to learn a very different lesson as the frost began to melt in the spring of 1775. A chill of a different kind settled over the Massachusetts countryside. General Gage, the British commander in Boston, received intelligence that the colonial militia, the Minutemen, were stockpiling weapons and gunpowder in the town of Concord. His mission was clear: to seize these supplies, and if possible, to arrest the revolutionary leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be in nearby Lexington. On the night of April 18th, under the cloak of darkness, he dispatched a column of about 700 British regulars, or redcoats as they were called, to march from Boston. Their journey was meant to be a secret, but the colonists were watching. Paul Revere and William Dawes, along with a number of other riders, famously set out on their midnight rides to warn the countryside. The familiar poem might tell you, one if by land and two if by sea, and that's exactly what the old North Church lantern signals were for, but the reality was a little more complicated. There were multiple riders, and they didn't just shout, "The British are coming," because most colonists still considered themselves British. Instead, they warned, "The regulars are coming out." A subtle but important distinction. The warning spread like a ripple in a quiet pond, waking sleeping farmers and blacksmiths who grabbed their muskets and began to gather. The British, of course, were not exactly sneaking through the woods. Their march was loud, and their boots were heavy, and the word traveled fast. By dawn on April 19th, the redcoats arrived in Lexington. They found a small group of about 77 Minutemen assembled on the town green. The sun was just peeking over the horizon, casting a soft, golden light on the tense scene. The British Major John Pitcairn, leading the advance guard, rode forward and ordered the colonists to disperse. "Lay down your arms, you rebels," he demanded. The Minutemen, led by Captain John Parker, were not about to back down. Parker had reportedly told his men, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." And then a shot rang out. No one knows for sure who fired it. Historians still argue whether it was a nervous colonist, an overzealous British soldier, or even an accidental discharge. But that single, unknown shot, the shot heard round the world, was the spark that ignited the war. The British soldiers, hearing the shot and perhaps misunderstanding their orders, opened fire in a chaotic volley. The Minutemen, outnumbered and surprised, scattered. 8 of them were killed and 10 were wounded. After this brief but bloody skirmish, the British continued their march to Concord. They found that most of the military supplies had already been moved thanks to the early warning. The redcoats did manage to destroy some remaining supplies, but it was a hollow victory. Meanwhile, colonial militias from all over the area were now converging on Concord. A second clash occurred at the North Bridge in Concord, where a force of several hundred Minutemen and militia confronted the British. This time, the colonists were the ones to open fire first, a strategic move. The British troops, now feeling outnumbered, began their long and harrowing retreat back to Boston. The return journey was a nightmare for the redcoats. The colonial militia, who were not a formal army but a loose collection of farmers and tradesmen, were masters of a new kind of warfare for the British. They didn't stand in neat lines to be shot at. Instead, they hid behind stone walls, trees, and buildings, firing at the British column from all sides. It was a relentless, punishing ambush. The redcoats, exhausted and suffering heavy casualties, were only saved when a relief column arrived from Boston. By the end of the day, the British had suffered about 273 casualties, while the Americans had lost around 95. The small engagement was a stunning moral victory for the colonists. The redcoats, the most feared and well-trained army in the world, had been chased all the way back to Boston by a bunch of farmers. The events of April 19th, 1775 had a profound effect. News of the battles spread quickly through the colonies, carried by fast riders and word of mouth. For many, it was the final turning point. The idea of a peaceful resolution was now a distant memory, replaced by the reality of open war. The Second Continental Congress convened just a few weeks later, now with a new urgency. They understood that they were no longer just protesting. They were fighting a war for their very survival. They needed a unified army, a single command structure, and a clear leader. They chose a man named George Washington to be the commander-in-chief of the newly formed Continental Army, a wealthy Virginia planter with military experience from the French and Indian War. He was a perfect choice because he was from the South, which helped to unite the colonies, and because he was seen as a man of impeccable character and resolve. The American Revolution had begun in earnest, and the siege of Boston was about to commence. The battles of Lexington and Concord are a classic example of a moment in history that seems small on the surface but has monumental consequences. That single shot, whether it came from a British musket or an American one, was not just a sound, it was a declaration. A declaration that the old world order was being challenged and that a new, very different one was about to be born. It was the moment that the colonists went from subjects of a king to rebels fighting for their own destiny. With the British forces now bottled up in Boston, a de facto siege began. The colonial militias, which had chased the redcoats back to the city, didn't just disperse. They gathered and grew. Men from all over New England, from farms and small towns, arrived with their muskets and their own ideas about how a war should be fought. This was not a professional army. They were a loose collection of citizen soldiers who elected their own officers and often came and went as they pleased. Yet their sheer numbers were enough to trap the British. They set up camps in a rough crescent around Boston, stretching from Roxbury to Cambridge and up to Charlestown. The British were confined to the peninsula, their supplies coming only by sea. The highest ground around Boston was the Dorchester Heights and the hills of the Charlestown Peninsula, specifically Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. From these vantage points, whoever held them would have a commanding view and could even place artillery to bombard the city and the British fleet in the harbor. Both sides knew this, and it was a race to see who could seize them first. The Americans, having grown tired of simply waiting, decided to make a move. On the night of June 16th, 1775, a force of about 1,200 colonial troops, under the command of Colonel William Prescott, were ordered to fortify Bunker Hill. For some reason, maybe confusion, or maybe just a bit of a strategic miscalculation, they instead marched to the closer and more exposed Breed's Hill. They worked through the night, digging a dirt redoubt, a sort of makeshift fort, with shovels and pickaxes, their movements a quiet scratching in the darkness. When the sun rose on June 17th, the British officers in Boston were stunned to see the American fortifications on Breed's Hill. It was a slap in the face. General Gage, under pressure from his more aggressive subordinates, made a rather predictable and frankly terrible decision. He ordered a frontal assault. A sensible commander might have just surrounded the position and starved them out, or landed troops behind them to cut them off. but a frontal assault was a very British, very confident, and very bloody approach. The British launched their attack in 3 waves. From Boston, they crossed the Charles River in longboats, their bright red coats standing out against the green hills. The American defenders waited, their nerves stretched taut. They were low on ammunition, so Colonel Prescott famously, or perhaps just apocryphally, gave the order, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." A perfect piece of advice for a group of men armed with smoothbore muskets that weren't exactly known for their long-range accuracy. The first British wave marched forward in their neat lines, drums beating, a beautiful but deadly procession. The Americans held their fire until the last possible moment, and then unleashed a devastating volley. The British lines were shredded. Men fell everywhere. They retreated in disarray. The second wave, reinforced and more determined, met the same fate. It was only on the third attempt that the British finally succeeded. The Americans were nearly out of ammunition, their musket balls and powder pouches almost empty. As the redcoats charged with bayonets fixed, the colonists were forced to retreat, fighting with clubbed muskets and rocks. The British took the hill, but at a terrible price. They suffered over 1,000 casualties, more than double the American losses. The British victory, if you can call it that, was a Pyrrhic one. Major General Henry Clinton, a British officer, later remarked, "A few more such victories will destroy us." The Battle of Bunker Hill, while technically a British victory, was a massive moral victory for the Americans. It proved that the colonial militias, a bunch of provincials, as the British called them, could stand up to the might of the British Army. It also showed the British that this was not a small, easily suppressed rebellion. These men were willing to fight and die for their cause. The siege of Boston continued, but now with a new sense of grim purpose on both sides. Meanwhile, back in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress was hard at work. George Washington was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, a decision that would prove to be one of the most important of the entire war. He arrived in Cambridge in July 1775 to take command of the ragtag force besieging Boston. The American troops were a disorganized mix of men with varying terms of enlistment, little discipline, and even less proper equipment. Washington's job was not just to win battles, but to create an actual army. A mainstream historical fact is that one of the first things Washington did was to establish a sense of military discipline, attempting to curb the independent spirit of the soldiers and instill a more professional structure. It was a long, slow process, but it was absolutely essential for the survival of the revolution. So the siege continued through the summer and fall, a sort of stalemate with occasional skirmishes, but no major attacks. The British were trapped in Boston, and the Americans lacked the heavy artillery to force them out. That was about to change, though, thanks to a very big man with an even bigger idea. But that's a story for another time, which is to say, the next section. While the stalemate held around Boston, a solution was being quietly and very laboriously worked out. The key to ending the siege lay not in a frontal assault, but in artillery. The British had cannons, of course, but the Americans had none of sufficient size to threaten the British position or their fleet in the harbor. The Continental Army's new commander, George Washington knew this. He also knew that a massive collection of cannons and mortars existed hundreds of miles away, captured by a small American force at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point in upstate New York earlier that year. The man chosen for the truly Herculean task of bringing them to Boston was a bookseller from Boston named Henry Knox. He was a large man, both in size and personality, with a mind for engineering and a surprising knack for artillery logistics, something you don't really learn from reading books, which is a bit of an irony. Knox's mission was simple in concept, but staggeringly difficult in execution. He had to travel to Fort Ticonderoga, collect the cannons, and transport them over 300 miles of rugged, frozen landscape in the dead of winter. It was a journey of epic proportions, a sort of real-life, historical video game quest where the main boss was the unforgiving New England weather. Knox and his team began their work in November 1775. They gathered 59 cannons and mortars, some of them weighing thousands of pounds, and loaded them onto sleds. For over 2 months, they pulled and pushed these massive weapons across the snow and ice, navigating frozen rivers and vast wooded wilderness. The procession was slow, often moving only a few miles a day. They battled blizzards, broken sleds, and the constant threat of the ice on the rivers giving way. It must have looked like something out of a crazy movie, a line of men and oxen pulling these immense metal tubes through the snow. Finally, in late January of 1776, the noble train of artillery, as it was called, arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The arrival of the cannons was a major boost to the morale of the Continental Army, a sign that things were actually happening. Washington now had the tools he needed to end the siege. His plan was to place the cannons on Dorchester Heights, a high point overlooking Boston and the harbor. From this elevated position, the Americans could bombard the city and make it untenable for the British. On the night of March 4th, under the cover of darkness, Washington's men began to fortify the heights. They used prefabricated structures and bales of hay to muffle the sound of their work. The ground was frozen solid, so they couldn't dig. Instead, they built up the fortifications, working in silence and with a speed that would have impressed any modern-day construction crew. The British, perhaps a little too comfortable and a little too arrogant, were caught completely off guard. When the sun rose on March 35th, the British commander, General William Howe, looked up at Dorchester Heights and saw the American cannons pointed directly at his fleet and his men. He was reportedly stunned, exclaiming, "My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than I could have made my army do in 3 months." The British were now in an impossible position. Their fleet, their lifeline, was in grave danger, and their soldiers in Boston were a clear target. Howe faced a difficult choice. He could either launch a suicidal frontal assault on the American position, much like the one that had failed so spectacularly at Bunker Hill, or he could withdraw. He decided to do something that had seemed unthinkable just a few months earlier. He chose to evacuate Boston. The British forces, along with thousands of loyalists who feared reprisal from the Patriots, began to pack up their belongings and board their ships. On March 17th, 1776, a day that is still celebrated in Boston as Evacuation Day, the last of the British ships sailed out of Boston Harbor. The Americans marched in, taking control of the city without firing a single shot. The siege was over. It was a monumental victory for the Continental Army and a huge psychological blow to the British. The Americans, for the first time, held a major city and had proven they could outmaneuver the British. The victory solidified George Washington's reputation as a competent military commander and showed the world that the American cause was a serious one. A mainstream historical fact is that this victory in Boston was a major factor in convincing the Second Continental Congress to declare independence just a few months later, on July 4th, 1776. It proved that the American people could achieve a military victory, and it gave them the confidence to break away from Great Britain for good. The war, of course, was far from over. The British fleet, now carrying General Howe and his army, sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to regroup and plan their next move. They would be back, and they would be bringing a much larger force, this time targeting the most important city of all, New York. The easy part of the war was over, and the truly difficult struggles were about to begin. But for now, the Americans could celebrate a victory won not just with courage, but with ingenuity and a whole lot of heavy lifting. While the British were sailing north to Halifax, and the Americans were celebrating in Boston, the war was already expanding. The British had a second front to consider, one far to the south, where they believed they had more support from loyalists. So even as the main army was in transit, a British expeditionary force was already on its way to the southern colonies. Their goal was to capture a major port city, establish a base of operations, and rally the local loyalists to their cause. The target they set their sights on was Charleston, South Carolina, a wealthy and strategically vital city. The British fleet, under the command of Admiral Sir Peter Parker, arrived off the coast of Charleston in early June 1776. The land forces were led by General Henry Clinton, the same man who had been a bit salty about the Pyrrhic victory at Bunker Hill. Their plan was straightforward. The ships would bombard a small American fort on Sullivan's Island, which defended the entrance to the harbor, while the land forces would make a landing on a nearby island and attack the fort from the rear. What could possibly go wrong, right? It seemed like a foolproof plan, a classic combination of naval power and land-based assault. The American defenders of the fort, a small but determined force of just over 400 men under Colonel William Moultrie, were a bit nervous. Their fort was a new construction, hastily built from the local material of palmetto logs and sand. This might not sound very impressive, but it turned out to be the key to their success. When the British warships opened fire, their cannonballs, instead of shattering the wooden walls, simply sank into the spongy palmetto logs or were absorbed by the soft sand. It was like shooting a cannonball into a giant pillow. The projectiles simply vanished. Moultrie's men, meanwhile, had their own cannons, and they were very effective. They fired at the British ships, and their shots were not absorbed by anything. They just went right through the British wooden hulls. The British land forces, under General Clinton, were also having a bad day. They tried to cross the inlet, separating their landing spot from Sullivan's Island, but they found the water was much deeper than they had anticipated. A mainstream historical fact is that Clinton's men were forced to stand on the other side of the water, watching in frustration as the naval battle unfolded, unable to assist their comrades. The naval bombardment was supposed to be the decisive blow, but it was proving to be a spectacular failure. The British warships were taking a pounding, and the Americans, from their cushy cannonball-absorbing fort, were holding their ground and firing back with a surprising amount of accuracy. After a 9-hour battle, the British fleet, badly damaged and unable to silence the fort's guns, was forced to withdraw. The expedition was a complete failure. They had sailed all that way, and all they had to show for it was a lot of dented ships and a bruised ego. General Clinton's army, having never even really gotten into the fight, eventually sailed away. The Battle of Sullivan's Island was a massive, morale-boosting victory for the Americans. It saved Charleston for nearly 4 years, and for a time ended the British threat in the South. This was a particularly sweet victory because it showed that the Americans could win against a combined British land and naval force, and it gave them a confidence they would need in the difficult years ahead. While all this was happening, something even more monumental was taking place in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress was debating independence. With the victory at Boston and the successful defense of Charleston, the argument for a full break from Great Britain was becoming more and more compelling. It was a time of great deliberation, with men like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin all wrestling with the idea of a complete and final separation. The Declaration of Independence, primarily written by Jefferson, was a powerful statement of a new philosophy of government, one that rested on the idea that all men are created equal and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so, on July 4th, 1776, the Declaration was approved. It wasn't signed by everyone on that day, and it took a while for the news to spread. This was, after all, a time before text messages and the 24-hour news cycle. When the news did finally reach the public, it was met with great celebrations, but also a sober recognition of the immense risk they were taking. This wasn't just a political squabble anymore. It was an all-out rebellion against the most powerful empire on earth. It was a daring move, a declaration of a new nation, and a declaration of war, all rolled into one. The Southern campaign had begun with a win, but the real test was coming. The British were about to launch a massive invasion of New York, a move that would put the newly declared United States to the test like never before. The game was truly on. With the war already underway in the South, and with a British fleet now regrouping in Halifax, a different theater of conflict was also heating up. A rather cold one, in fact. The Americans, in a moment of boundless optimism, decided to invade Canada. The goal was to seize Quebec, the capital of British-held Canada, and to bring the French-speaking population there into the Revolution. The thought was that the Canadians, who were recently conquered by the British in the French and Indian War, would be eager to throw off the British yoke and join the cause for liberty. It was a noble idea, but one based on a rather shaky premise. The plan was a two-pronged assault. One force, under the command of General Richard Montgomery, would advance north along Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River, a relatively well-traveled route. The other, far more difficult prong was a force led by a young colonel named Benedict Arnold. His mission was to lead a small army through the vast, untamed wilderness of Maine, a journey of over 300 miles that would take them up the Kennebec River and across a brutal portage to the Chaudière River, which led to Quebec City. This part of the plan sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, and in many ways it was. Montgomery's part of the mission went relatively well at first. He captured Fort Chambly and then St. John's, and finally took Montreal in November 1775. The British governor, Guy Carleton, managed to escape just in time and retreated to Quebec City. Things were looking good for the Americans, and it seemed like their grand plan might actually work. Meanwhile, Benedict Arnold's march through the Maine wilderness was a story of epic hardship. The journey was a race against time, as winter was setting in fast. The men, who were not prepared for such a grueling expedition, suffered terribly. They were constantly wet, their boats leaked, and their food supplies dwindled to nothing. They ate their dogs, and then their shoe leather, and many of them, sick and starving, turned back. A mainstream historical fact is that Arnold's troops suffered a desertion rate of nearly 1/3 of their force before they even reached Quebec, a clear sign of the immense suffering they endured. When they finally emerged from the wilderness in November, they were a shadow of their former selves, sick, exhausted, and barely able to stand, let alone fight. Despite their condition, Arnold's forces managed to lay siege to Quebec City. It was a desperate gamble. They lacked the heavy artillery to breach the city's walls, and the men were not in any condition to mount a full-scale assault. They had to wait for Montgomery to arrive with his forces from Montreal. When Montgomery's army finally showed up, the combined American force was still too small and too weak to take the well-fortified city by conventional means. With enlistments for many of their soldiers about to expire and facing the harsh Canadian winter, the American commanders decided to risk everything on a desperate, last-ditch attack. On the night of December 31st, 1775, under the cover of a blinding blizzard, they launched a two-pronged assault on the city. The plan was to create a diversion and then attack the lower town from two different directions, hoping to surprise the defenders. But the plan went horribly wrong. The British were alerted, and the blinding snowstorm, which was supposed to be the Americans' ally, worked against them. Richard Montgomery was killed by a blast of grapeshot in the very first minutes of the attack, a huge blow to American morale. Benedict Arnold was also severely wounded in the leg and had to be carried to the rear. Without their leaders and facing heavy British fire, the American forces were routed. Many were killed or captured, and the survivors were forced to retreat. The remnants of the American army remained outside Quebec, continuing a weak siege through the brutal winter, but it was a lost cause. With the arrival of British reinforcements in the spring, the Americans were forced to retreat all the way back to Fort Ticonderoga. The invasion of Canada was a complete and total failure. It was a sobering lesson for the Continental Army, a reminder that desire and courage were not enough to win a war. The British had learned that the American spirit was strong, but they also learned that the American army was not invincible, a lesson that would serve them well in the coming campaigns. The Canadian invasion was a story of incredible bravery and immense suffering, but ultimately it was a detour on the road to American independence. With that front closed, all eyes turned to the next major battleground, the city where the British would launch their biggest offensive of the war, New York. After their embarrassing retreat from Boston and their failed attempt to take Charleston, the British were not about to give up. In fact, they were just getting started. General William Howe, now with his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, was given command of a massive British force that began to converge on New York City. The city was a prime target for a number of reasons. It was a key port, it had a large number of Loyalist residents, and its capture would be a major psychological and strategic blow to the American cause. For the Americans, holding New York was a challenge. It was a city of islands and waterways, something that made it very difficult to defend against a powerful naval force. George Washington, realizing the immense strategic importance of New York, moved his Continental Army there from Boston. He had about 19,000 men, a mix of regulars and militia, but they were still a green and inexperienced force. The British, on the other hand, had amassed a force of over 32,000 professional soldiers, including thousands of highly trained Hessian mercenaries, a force that was utterly overwhelming. The British fleet also consisted of more than 400 ships, the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had ever assembled. It was a mismatch on a grand scale, like a high school football team trying to play against the NFL. The British invasion began in earnest in late June 1776, with the Howes landing their forces on Staten Island. Washington, knowing he couldn't hold the city itself, decided to defend Long Island, which would be the most likely landing spot for the main British assault. He deployed a significant portion of his army there, under the command of General Israel Putnam. The terrain on Long Island was a complex mix of hills, swamps, and dense woods, which Washington hoped would give his men an advantage against the British in their neat, linear formations. On August 27th, the Battle of Long Island began. It was a classic British maneuver, a perfectly executed flanking attack. While a smaller British force attacked the American front to hold their attention, General Howe led the main body of his army on a wide, sweeping march around the American left flank, which was left completely undefended. The Americans were caught by surprise and were utterly routed. It was a military disaster. American forces suffered heavy casualties, with over 1,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The British victory was swift and decisive, and it put the entire Continental Army in grave danger of being annihilated. Washington, watching from a nearby hill, realized the full extent of the calamity. His army was trapped on Long Island, with its back to the East River. The British, with their superior numbers and their naval control of the surrounding waters, seemed to have them cornered. A mainstream historical fact is that many of Washington's own generals believed the army's destruction was imminent, and some were even advising surrender. But Washington, with a resolve that would define his entire career, refused to give up. He knew that the very survival of the American cause depended on saving his army, not on winning any single battle. Under the cover of a thick fog, on the night of August 29th, in a masterful and daring retreat, Washington managed to evacuate his entire army from Long Island across the East River to Manhattan. Using every boat he could find, His men worked all night, silently rowing thousands of soldiers, their horses, and even their equipment across the water. By dawn, when the fog finally lifted, the British were astonished to find the American camps empty. The redcoats, who had been so sure of victory, were left staring at an empty shore. The retreat from Long Island was a testament to Washington's leadership and ingenuity, but the war for New York was far from over. The Americans were forced to abandon the city and retreat northward, engaging in a series of smaller skirmishes and battles, including the Battle of Harlem Heights and the Battle of White Plains. The British, with their superior numbers and constant pressure, pushed Washington's army farther and farther back. The morale of the Continental Army plummeted. Desertions were high, and many soldiers' enlistments were coming to an end. It was a dark time. The summer of 1776, a time that had begun with such hope and the Declaration of Independence, was ending in a series of demoralizing defeats. Washington's army was on the run, and the fate of the American Revolution seemed to hang by a very, very thin thread. The question was not if the army would lose, but when and what would happen next. The autumn of 1776 was a time of immense despair for the Continental Army. They had been chased out of New York, a defeat that seemed to validate the British belief that the rebellion was on the verge of collapse. George Washington and his weary men were in full retreat, falling back across New Jersey with the massive British army under General Howe in close pursuit. The American army was shrinking every day as enlistments expired and discouraged soldiers simply packed up and went home. The hope that had blossomed in the spring and summer seemed to be withering away in the cold December air. Washington knew that he needed to do something bold, something unexpected, to revive the American cause and give the people something to believe in. He had to cross the Delaware River and make a stand. A mainstream historical fact is that the morale of the American troops was so low that Washington knew if he did not act, his army would simply cease to exist by the end of the year. He decided on a desperate gamble, a surprise attack on a Hessian garrison in Trenton, New Jersey. The Hessians, German mercenaries hired by the British, were professional soldiers, but they were also known for their love of a good party, especially around the holidays. Washington was betting on it. The plan was a coordinated three-pronged attack. The main force, under Washington himself, would cross the Delaware River north of Trenton. The other two forces, under Generals Cadwalader and Ewing, would cross the river at different points to block any escape routes and provide support. But a Christmas night river crossing in the dead of winter is not for the faint of heart. It was a brutal night, sleeting, snowing, and freezing cold. The river was choked with ice floes, and the crossing was treacherous. The other two American forces were unable to make it across, leaving Washington's men alone. It was a colossal logistical mess, and it took hours to get all the men and their artillery across the icy river. By the time they landed on the New Jersey side, they were hours behind schedule and soaked to the bone. They still had a long march to Trenton ahead of them. Despite the setbacks, Washington pushed on. The American troops, in their ragged uniforms and with their worn-out shoes, marched 9 miles through the snow and freezing rain. It was a silent march, their feet making soft, crunching sounds in the snow, the only other sound being the wind and the occasional shivering of a man. They arrived at Trenton just after dawn, utterly surprising the Hessian garrison. The Hessians, who had likely been enjoying their Christmas celebrations, were caught completely off guard. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rahl, was killed in the early minutes of the battle, and the disciplined Hessian troops, without their leader, were thrown into chaos. The battle was over. In a flash, nearly 900 Hessians were captured, and over 100 were killed or wounded, while the Americans suffered only a handful of casualties. Washington's men also captured a large number of valuable supplies, including guns, ammunition, and other military equipment. The victory at Trenton was a massive psychological boost, but Washington knew it was not a permanent solution. The British Army was still nearby, and they would be looking for revenge. Washington, ever the brilliant strategist, decided on another bold move. He recrossed the Delaware with his prisoners, gave his men a brief rest, and then went back across the river, this time setting up camp near Trenton. General Cornwallis, the British commander, was furious and immediately marched his troops to Trenton to confront Washington. He arrived on January the 2nd, 1777, and the two armies faced off across a small creek. The next day, Washington did something completely unexpected. Under the cover of darkness, he left his campfires burning and marched his men on a wide, sweeping arc around the British forces and headed for Princeton, a key British supply depot. When Cornwallis's men woke up, they were stunned to find the American camp empty. Washington, meanwhile, had surprised another British force at Princeton. The battle was a short, sharp engagement, and while it was a tough fight, the Americans were once again victorious. They captured the town and its valuable supplies, and they showed the British that they could not be cornered. The victories at Trenton and Princeton were a turning point in the war. They were not major military triumphs in the grand scheme of things, but they had a profound effect on American morale. They proved that Washington was a capable commander and that the Continental Army, despite its setbacks, could still win. It drew new recruits to the army and convinced the doubters that the American cause was not lost. It was a gambit that worked, a move that changed the course of the war and ensured that the American dream would live to fight another day. After the twin victories at Trenton and Princeton, Washington's army settled into winter quarters at Morristown, New Jersey. The victories had certainly lifted American spirits, but the British still held New York City and its surrounding area. The year 1777 would prove to be a pivotal one, with the British launching a new strategy to end the war. Their plan was audacious, a three-pronged attack to cut New England, the hotbed of rebellion, off from the rest of the colonies. One force under General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada. A second, smaller force under Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger would move east from Lake Ontario. The third and largest force, under General William Howe, would move north from New York City up the Hudson River to meet Burgoyne. The idea was to squeeze the rebellion into submission. It was a good plan on paper, but history, as we know, is rarely a neat, paper-based affair. Howe, however, had his own ideas. Instead of moving north to link up with Burgoyne, he decided to attack Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress and the American capital. Historians still argue whether this was a fatal strategic error or a reasonable gamble, Howe believed that by capturing the capital, he would demoralize the Americans and end the war. This decision, however, left Burgoyne completely unsupported and exposed. Howe's campaign to capture Philadelphia began in the summer of 1777. Instead of marching overland, he decided to move his army by sea, a long and complicated voyage that took weeks. His fleet sailed from New York, down the coast, and up the Chesapeake Bay, finally landing his troops near Head of Elk, Maryland, in late August. Washington, with his Continental Army, marched to meet him. The two armies clashed on September 11th at the Battle of Brandywine Creek in Pennsylvania. The battle was a tactical masterpiece by General Howe. He once again used a flanking maneuver, similar to the one he had used so successfully at Long Island. He sent a large portion of his army on a wide march to cross the Brandywine Creek and attack Washington's flank. Washington, who was in a strong defensive position, was caught by surprise. The American forces fought bravely, but they were no match for the professional British army. The Americans were forced to retreat, and the British had a clear path to Philadelphia. Washington, however, once again managed to save his army from annihilation, a much-needed skill he was perfecting. After the defeat at Brandywine, the Continental Congress, with a great deal of anxiety, evacuated Philadelphia. The British marched in and occupied the city on September 26th. While the capture of the capital was a symbolic victory for the British, it didn't end the war. The Continental Army was still intact and was a constant threat. In fact, Washington launched a daring but ultimately unsuccessful counterattack on October 4th at the Battle of Germantown, just outside Philadelphia. The battle was a complex, poorly coordinated, and chaotic affair, fought in a thick fog. The American forces, though initially successful, ended up firing on each other in the confusion, leading to another American defeat. It was a frustrating and heartbreaking loss, especially after all the effort. One could say it was like trying to win a game of hide and seek when everyone is wearing the same outfit. Despite these tactical defeats, the American cause was far from lost. The British now held two of the most important cities, but they did not control the countryside. They were also learning a painful lesson. Holding territory was far more difficult than capturing it. More importantly, while Howe was busy with Philadelphia, the other part of the British plan was unfolding in the north, and it was about to go spectacularly wrong for the British and spectacularly right for the Americans. The stage was set for the true turning point of the war, a moment that would change the course of history and bring a powerful new ally to the American side. But we'll get to that in our next session, as the story of the Northern Campaign is a big one. For now, know that while the British were feeling pretty good about themselves for taking Philadelphia, their victory was about to be overshadowed by a defeat of epic proportions. While General Howe was busy capturing Philadelphia, a different and much more consequential drama was unfolding in the northern theater of the war. General John Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, a man known more for his love of the theater and a good party than for his military prowess, was leading a large British army south from Canada. His mission, as a reminder, was to link up with forces from New York and savor New England from the other colonies. Burgoyne's plan started out with great promise. He captured Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain, a major American stronghold, with surprising ease. The Americans, under General Arthur St. Clair, had abandoned the fort in a rather embarrassing retreat, much to Washington's chagrin. A mainstream historical fact is that the British capture of Fort Ticonderoga in the 1777 was initially seen as a major British victory, and the news was met with great celebration in London. But Burgoyne's luck began to turn shortly thereafter. His army, with its long baggage train and its love of a good, formal march, was not suited for the dense, rugged wilderness of upstate New York. The Americans, under the command of General Philip Schuyler and then later General Horatio Gates, used the terrain to their advantage. They felled trees and destroyed bridges, slowing the British advance to a crawl. The American militia, using their knowledge of the local landscape, harassed the British from all sides, picking off stragglers and slowing their supply lines. Burgoyne's progress was agonizingly slow. He was moving at a pace that could be measured in feet per day, not miles. One could say he was living the historical version of a traffic jam, only with a lot more mosquitoes and a lot more gunfire. Burgoyne's forces were also suffering from a lack of food and supplies. A large detachment he sent to collect supplies was ambushed and defeated at the Battle of Bennington by American militia, a battle that cost him nearly 1,000 men and was a huge morale booster for the Americans. By the time Burgoyne reached the area of Saratoga, his army was exhausted and running out of supplies. The American forces, under the command of General Horatio Gates, were now dug in on Bemis Heights, a strong defensive position. Gates was a cautious commander, but he was supported by the more aggressive and brilliant General Benedict Arnold, who ironically was about to be the hero of the day. The two armies faced off in a series of battles known as the Battles of Saratoga. The first battle, on September 19th, was a bloody and indecisive affair, but it showed the Americans that they could stand their ground against the British regulars. The second and decisive battle occurred on October 7th. Burgoyne, desperate to break through the American lines, launched a final attack. The British forces were met with fierce resistance. Benedict Arnold, despite being relieved of his command by the cautious Gates, rode out onto the battlefield and rallied the American troops. He led a charge that broke the British lines and turned the tide of the battle. Arnold, the man who would later become a traitor, was the hero of Saratoga. He was shot in the leg, the same leg that had been wounded in the Canada campaign, but his bravery was undeniable. The American victory was total. Burgoyne's army was surrounded and had no hope of escape. On October 17th, 1777, General Burgoyne formally surrendered his entire army of over 6,000 men. It was a stunning and a completely unexpected American victory. The American Revolution, which had been on the brink of collapse just months earlier, now had a major victory to its name. The victory at Saratoga was the turning point of the war for one simple diplomatic reason. It convinced the French to openly ally with the Americans. The French had been secretly providing the Americans with aid for a while, but they had been hesitant to openly declare war on Great Britain. The victory at Saratoga showed them that the American cause was a viable one, and that the Americans could actually win. The French, who still smarted from their defeat by the British in the French and Indian War, saw a perfect opportunity to get revenge and weaken their old rival. In February 1778, France and the United States signed the Treaty of Alliance, a treaty that recognized the United States as an independent nation and promised them military and financial support. The French alliance changed everything. It provided the Continental Army with much-needed money, supplies, and most importantly, a powerful navy that could challenge British naval dominance. For the British, the war was no longer a simple rebellion. It was now a global conflict. They were now fighting not just the Americans, but also the French, and eventually the Spanish and the Dutch would join in as well. The victory at Saratoga had given the American Revolution a new life, and it had set the stage for a much longer and more complicated war. With the momentous victory at Saratoga and the promise of French aid, the Continental Army settled into a long, brutal winter. They were not, however, settled in comfort. George Washington and his army of roughly 12,000 men made their winter encampment at Valley Forge, about 20 miles northwest of the British-occupied Philadelphia. The choice of location was a strategic one, close enough to keep an eye on Howe's forces, but far enough away to be relatively safe from a surprise attack. What followed was a period of immense suffering that would become legendary. The winter of 1778 was one of the coldest on record. The soldiers, many of whom were still wearing the same ragged clothes they had marched in all fall, were not equipped for the harsh conditions. They lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. The supply chain had completely broken down, a result of both bureaucratic incompetence and a lack of funding from the Continental Congress. Soldiers were freezing, starving, and sick. Disease, especially typhus and smallpox, spread like wildfire through the cramped, unsanitary huts. A mainstream historical fact is that nearly 2,000 American soldiers, or about 1/6 of the entire army, died at Valley Forge, not from fighting, but from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. The conditions were so terrible that it's a wonder the army didn't simply melt away completely. But something remarkable happened at Valley Forge. A new arrival, a Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben, appeared on the scene. Von Steuben was a bit of a character, a flamboyant, larger-than-life figure who, despite not speaking English very well, had a genius for military training. He was a veteran of the Prussian army, which was considered the best in Europe, and he was horrified by the state of the American troops. They were disorganized, undisciplined, and had no real idea of how to operate as a professional army. Von Steuben immediately set about changing that. He didn't just teach the officers, he got down in the mud and personally drilled the soldiers. He taught them how to use the bayonet, how to load and fire their muskets in a coordinated volley, and how to perform complex maneuvers. He wrote a manual of military drill, simplifying the European style for the American army. He also had a foul mouth, and he would often curse at the soldiers in German and French, with an aide having to translate his colorful language into English. One could say he was the original tough love fitness instructor for a brand new army. The training was grueling, but it was also incredibly effective. The soldiers, despite their immense suffering, began to take on the appearance of a professional fighting force. They learned discipline, they learned how to act as a unit, and they developed a sense of pride in their skills. The transformation was slow, But by the time spring arrived, the Continental Army that marched out of Valley Forge was a completely different force than the one that had marched in. It was a smaller army, but it was a better one. While the Americans were suffering and training at Valley Forge, the British in Philadelphia were having a grand old time. They were comfortable, well fed, and they were putting on plays and throwing parties. But they weren't really accomplishing much. Their capture of the city had not led to the end of the rebellion, and now with the French alliance, the strategic situation had completely changed. The British High Command and the King were now facing a much larger war, and they knew they had to change their strategy. The British government recalled General Howe, and a new commander, General Henry Clinton, was put in charge. Clinton was ordered to consolidate his forces and to abandon Philadelphia. The British were no longer trying to defeat the rebellion in a single blow. They were now trying to contain it and win a war of attrition. The American ordeal at Valley Forge was over, and the army, hardened by its suffering and now professionally trained, was ready to take on the British again. The next stage of the war was about to begin, and the first test for the newly trained Continental Army was just around the corner, as the British began their march out of Philadelphia. The British evacuation of Philadelphia began in June 1778. General Henry Clinton, the new British commander-in-chief, was under orders to abandon the city and consolidate his forces in New York City, where the British could be more easily supplied by the Royal Navy. The march of the British Army across New Jersey was a massive logistical undertaking. It was a long, slow column of over 10,000 soldiers, stretching for miles, accompanied by a huge train of baggage wagons, horses, and camp followers. It was a hot, humid summer, and the British soldiers, burdened by their heavy wool uniforms, were miserable. George Washington, seeing an opportunity to strike at the retreating enemy, decided to follow. His newly trained Continental Army, hardened by the winter at Valley Forge, was a far more formidable force. Washington wanted to engage the British in a major battle, but his generals were divided on the matter. Some, including the perpetually cautious General Charles Lee, argued against a direct engagement, fearing a repeat of the past defeats. Lee, who had recently been exchanged from British captivity, was particularly vocal in his opposition, believing that the American army was not ready. Washington, however, was determined. He ordered Lee to take an advance guard of about 5,000 men and attack the British rear guard. Lee, who had originally resisted the idea, was hesitant, and his actions during the battle would later become a matter of great controversy. The two armies met on June 28th at Monmouth Courthouse. The day was sweltering hot, with temperatures well over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and it would later be remembered as the hottest day of the war. The battle began with Lee's advance guard launching a disorganized and confusing attack on the British rear. The American attack was clumsy, and when the British counterattacked, Lee ordered a chaotic retreat. It was a complete and utter disaster. Washington, who was following with the main army, was furious. He rode up to the front, and in a rare display of public anger, he reportedly confronted Lee, demanding an explanation for the retreat. The encounter was heated, and a mainstream historical fact is that Washington's aide-de-camp, the young Marquis de Lafayette, later recounted that he had never seen Washington so angry. Washington then took personal command, rallying the retreating troops and organizing them into a new defensive line. The rest of the battle was a long, brutal engagement fought in the intense heat. The American soldiers, however, showed their mettle. They stood their ground and fought the professional British regulars to a standstill. The training they had received from Baron von Steuben at Valley Forge was paying off. They loaded and fired their muskets with a discipline they had never shown before, and they held their lines against repeated British charges. The battle went on for hours, with both sides suffering heavy casualties from the fighting and the heat. One could say the real winner that day was heat exhaustion. By the end of the day, both armies were exhausted. The British slipped away in the night, continuing their march to New York. The battle was, in a tactical sense, a draw. The British had managed to continue their retreat, and the Americans had failed to deliver a decisive blow. But in a strategic and moral sense, it was a massive American victory. It proved that the Continental Army, a force that had been on the verge of collapse just a few months earlier, could now stand toe-to-toe with the British regulars, and not only survive, but hold its own. It was a sign of a new, more professional American army. General Lee, for his part, was later court-martialed for his actions at Monmouth. He was found guilty of disobedience and was suspended from command for a year, a punishment that effectively ended his military career. The Battle of Monmouth also saw the legend of Molly Pitcher come to life, a woman who, according to legend, carried water to the soldiers and even took her husband's place at a cannon after he fell, a story that, whether completely true or not, shows the spirit of the time. The British, meanwhile, finally reached the safety of New York City. The war had settled into a stalemate. The British held New York, but they had failed to destroy Washington's army, and with the French now in the war, the conflict was about to get a whole lot more complicated. With the main armies bogged down in a stalemate in the north, the war didn't just stop, it shifted. The vast, untamed wilderness west of the Appalachian Mountains became a new, brutal theater of conflict. This wasn't a war of professional armies standing in neat lines. This was a war of frontiersmen and Native American tribes, a series of bloody skirmishes and raids that stretched from the Ohio Valley all the way up to the Great Lakes. The British, operating out of their forts in Canada and the Great Lakes region, actively encouraged and supplied their Native American allies, many of whom had their own long-standing grievances with the American colonists who were encroaching on their land. The American forces on the frontier were a mixed bag. They were not part of the main Continental Army, but were local militia and frontiersmen, led by men who knew the territory like the back of their hand. The most notable of these was a man named George Rogers Clark, a tall, imposing Virginian who had a very big idea. He believed that the key to securing the western frontier was not to just defend it, but to go on the offensive. A mainstream historical fact is that Clark was given permission by Virginia Governor Patrick Henry to lead a secret expedition to capture the British forts in the Illinois country. In 1778, Clark and his small force of about 175 men set out on their incredible journey. They traveled by river, paddling their way down the Ohio River, and then marched overland through the swampy wilderness. They were a ghost army, moving silently and swiftly. They surprised and captured the British outposts of Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and Vincennes, all without firing a shot. The French inhabitants of these towns, who were still culturally connected to France, were happy to see the British gone and welcomed the Americans. The British, however, were not about to let their western forts go so easily. The British commander at Detroit, Henry Hamilton, a man known by the Americans as the hair buyer for allegedly paying Native Americans for American scalps, a charge historians still debate, led a force to retake the forts. Hamilton easily recaptured Vincennes in late 1778, and the American cause in the West seemed to be on the verge of collapse. But George Rogers Clark was not a man to give up. In the dead of winter in 1779, in a move that sounds a bit like Washington's crossing of the Delaware, he decided to launch a surprise attack on Vincennes. His men marched over 180 miles through freezing, flooded land, with some parts of the march taking place in chest-deep water. They were cold, wet, and hungry, but they pushed on, their determination a testament to their leader's resolve. When they arrived at Vincennes in February, they were a complete surprise. Clark, with a clever bit of deception, made his small force appear much larger than it was, using a line of men carrying multiple flags to make it seem like a massive army was approaching. The British, thinking they were surrounded by a superior force, surrendered the fort. The capture of Vincennes was a huge victory for the Americans. It not only secured a vast tract of land for the new nation, but it also helped to neutralize the British threat on the western frontier. While Clark was busy in the west, the war in other parts of the frontier was a lot more brutal. The Iroquois Confederacy, which was largely allied with the British, launched a series of devastating raids on American settlements in New York and Pennsylvania. In response, Washington ordered a scorched earth campaign under General John Sullivan. In the summer of 1779, Sullivan's army marched through Iroquois territory, burning villages and destroying crops. It was a harsh and brutal campaign that effectively broke the Iroquois' power, but it also cemented a deep-seated hatred between the two peoples that would last for generations. The war on the western frontier was a grim and often forgotten part of the Revolution, a conflict that was less about grand strategy and more about survival, and it left a lasting legacy of bitterness and conflict between the American settlers and the native tribes. While the land war in America was stuck in a stalemate in the North and a brutal, chaotic conflict in the West, a different kind of war was being fought on the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The American cause depended on a steady flow of supplies and money from Europe, and the British Royal Navy, the most powerful navy in the world, was determined to stop it. The British had thousands of warships and a long history of naval dominance. The Americans, by contrast, had no real navy to speak of. They had a handful of ships, not nearly enough to challenge the British at sea. It was a bit like trying to fight a T-Rex with a slingshot. So the Continental Congress, in a move of great desperation and ingenuity, decided on a different strategy. They commissioned privateers. A privateer was a privately owned armed ship that was given a government commission, a letter of marque, to attack and capture enemy merchant ships. It was a form of legalized piracy, and it was a very effective way to wage economic warfare. Privateers were an essential part of the American war effort. They were not part of the Continental Navy, and they were, in many ways, just a bunch of guys who saw a chance to make a profit while also helping the cause. A mainstream historical fact is that during the war, American privateers captured or sank more than 600 British ships, a staggering number that had a significant impact on British trade and morale. But the Americans also had a few actual naval heroes. The most famous of them was a man named John Paul Jones, a Scottish-born American naval officer. Jones was a bit of a hothead, a man of great ambition and great ego, but he was also a brilliant and fearless commander. He was given command of a small fleet of ships, and in 1779 he sailed to the coasts of Great Britain itself, a move that was audacious to the point of seeming insane. The idea was to bring the war home to the British, to show them that they were not safe, even in their own waters. It was an incredibly brave move. Jones's most famous battle took place on September 23, 1779, off the coast of Flamborough Head, England. Jones, in his ship, the USS Bonhomme Richard, a converted French merchant ship, faced off against the HMS Serapis, a British warship. It was a classic duel between two ships. The battle was long and brutal. Both ships were badly damaged, and the American ship, the Bonhomme Richard, was on the verge of sinking. The British commander, Captain Richard Pearson, seeing the state of the American ship, called out, "Has your ship struck?" To which Jones famously replied, "I have not yet begun to fight." It was a moment of incredible defiance, a declaration that he would rather go down with his ship than surrender. The battle continued, and in a clever piece of tactical maneuvering, Jones managed to ram his ship into the Serapis and lash the two ships together. The fighting became a desperate, hand-to-hand affair, and in the end, the Americans were victorious. The British ship surrendered, and Jones, his own ship sinking, transferred his crew and his prisoners to the captured vessel. The victory was a massive propaganda triumph for the Americans. It showed that even a small, fledgling navy could defeat the Royal Navy, and it made John Paul Jones a legend on both sides of the Atlantic. The British, who had been so sure of their naval dominance, were now a little bit less so. The naval war, while not as decisive as the land war, was a crucial part of the American victory. It disrupted British trade, it boosted American morale, and it kept the supply lines from France open. It was a reminder that war is not just fought with armies on a battlefield. It is also fought in the quiet and not so quiet struggle for economic and strategic dominance. The American naval heroes, from the daring privateers to the legendary John Paul Jones, were a testament to the ingenuity and courage of a new nation that was still learning how to fight and how to win a very different kind of war. By 1778, the war in the North had settled into a kind of stalemate. The British held New York, but they were unable to destroy Washington's army, which was now better trained and more resilient. With the French alliance, the British now had a global war to worry about, and their military resources were stretched thin. So they decided on a new strategy. They would focus their efforts on the South. The British High Command believed that the southern colonies, with their large number of loyalists and their valuable agricultural products like tobacco and rice, would be easier to conquer and hold. They figured that if they could secure the South, they could use it as a base to slowly squeeze the rebellion in the North. It was a risky but logical plan, and it would turn the Southern colonies into the main theater of war for the next 3 years. The British plan was to start in Georgia, the youngest and smallest of the colonies, and then work their way north through the Carolinas and into Virginia. They believed that if they could capture the major port cities and then move into the countryside, the Loyalists would flock to their side and help them defeat the Patriots. It was a strategy based on a fundamental miscalculation about the level of Loyalist support. While there were certainly many Loyalists in the South, there were also many Patriots, and they were not about to give up without a fight. The British launched their Southern strategy in December of 1778 with an attack on Savannah, Georgia. A force of about 3,500 British troops, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Archibald Campbell, landed near the city. The American defenders were a small force of a few hundred men under the command of General Robert Howe, who for some reason decided to make a stand in a difficult defensive position. The British, with their superior numbers and training, easily outflanked the American forces and routed them. The British captured Savannah, and a few weeks later, they captured Augusta, the capital of Georgia. The entire colony was now back under British control, and the British began to set up a new colonial government. The first phase of the Southern strategy was a complete success. Meanwhile, the Americans in the South were in disarray. The Continental Army had a very small presence there, and the defense was left to the local militia, which was often poorly organized and poorly supplied. The British, however, were not the only threat. The conflict in the South was also a brutal civil war between Loyalists and Patriots, with both sides conducting raids, burning farms, and killing civilians. It was a conflict that was far more personal and far more savage than the more conventional warfare being fought in the North. After securing Georgia, the British moved their sights to South Carolina, and they set their sights on Charleston, the most important port city in the South. General Henry Clinton, the British commander-in-chief, decided to personally lead a large force to capture the city. It was a huge undertaking, with a large British fleet and an army of over 10,000 men. The American commander in Charleston, General Benjamin Lincoln, made the fateful decision to defend the city instead of retreating and preserving his army. The British laid siege to Charleston in the spring of 1780. The city was well fortified, but it was also surrounded by the British on both land and sea. The siege was a long, slow process, with the British using their heavy artillery to pound the American defenses. The Americans, trapped in the city, had no hope of relief. On May 12, 1780, General Lincoln was forced to surrender. The British captured over 5,000 American soldiers, a massive blow to the American cause and one of the worst defeats of the entire war. The fall of Charleston was a major setback for the Americans. The British now had a secure base in the South, and they had captured a significant portion of the Continental Army's Southern forces. The Southern campaign, which had started so well for the British, was about to become a lot more complicated. The Loyalists they had been counting on were not as numerous as they had hoped, and the Patriots in the backcountry were about to launch a new kind of war, a guerrilla war that would prove to be a thorn in the British side for years to come. With the British now in control of Savannah and Charleston, the stage was set for the main part of their southern campaign. Lord Charles Cornwallis, a capable and experienced British general, was put in charge of the forces in the South. He was determined to crush the rebellion in the Carolinas and then move on to Virginia. But he was about to learn a very hard lesson about a different kind of war, a war of shadows and quick strikes. This was the world of partisan warfare, and the king of this world was a man named Francis Marion, a figure so elusive and so effective that he earned the nickname the Swamp Fox. Marion was a small, quiet man, but he was a genius at unconventional warfare. His men were a mix of farmers, frontiersmen, and other locals who knew the southern landscape, with its dense swamps and thick forests, better than anyone. They didn't fight in neat lines like the British regulars. They used the terrain to their advantage, appearing out of nowhere, striking a quick blow, and then disappearing back into the swamps. Their style of fighting was a constant source of frustration for the British. They would raid British supply lines, ambush small patrols, and generally make life miserable for Cornwallis's men. A mainstream historical fact is that the British were so exasperated by Marion's tactics that they even sent a special force to try to hunt him down, but they were never able to catch him. But the American cause in the South was still in a very precarious position. After the fall of Charleston, the Continental Congress sent a new commander, General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, to take command of the remaining American forces. Gates was a man who had a great reputation, but he was about to make a series of very poor decisions. He chose a direct route to confront the British forces under Cornwallis, a route that took him through a region with very little food and water. His men, already sick and exhausted, were in no condition to fight. The two armies met on August 16th, 1780, at the Battle of Camden, South Carolina. The battle was a complete and utter disaster for the Americans. Gates made a fatal error by placing his inexperienced militia on his left flank directly opposite the best of the British troops. When the British attacked, the American militia, who were not prepared for a frontal assault, broke and ran. The Continental Army regulars, who were on the other side of the line, fought bravely, but they were quickly overwhelmed. The American army was completely routed. Hundreds of American soldiers were killed or wounded, and thousands more were captured or scattered. General Gates, in a move that historians still argue about, fled the field on horseback, riding over 180 miles in just 3 days, a rather quick trip for a man who was supposed to be leading an army. One could say he ran faster than his reputation. The defeat at Camden was a major setback for the Americans. It left the Continental Army in the South in shambles, and it gave the British a sense of invincibility. Cornwallis was now confident that he could march through the Carolinas and Virginia without any real opposition. He believed that the war in the South was all but won, but the British success was about to be challenged not by a professional army, but by a different kind of fighter, a group of backwoodsmen who were about to fight a battle that would be a turning point in the Southern campaign. The British were about to find out that while they may have defeated the American army, they had not defeated the American people. The partisan warfare would continue, and the civil war between loyalists and patriots would only get more brutal, setting the stage for a new kind of conflict, one that would be fought in the shadows, not on the open field. The defeat at Camden was a bitter pill to swallow for the Americans, but it also lit a fuse in the hearts of the Southern patriots. The British, with their newfound confidence, began to move into the backcountry of the Carolinas, a region populated by rugged, independent-minded farmers and frontiersmen. Lord Cornwallis, in an attempt to pacify the region, sent a force of loyalists and British regulars under the command of Major Patrick Ferguson. Ferguson was a capable officer, but he was also a man who was very fond of making threats. He sent a message to the over-the-mountain men, the frontiersmen who lived west of the Appalachians, warning them that if they did not stop their rebellion, he would march his army over the mountains and lay waste their country with fire and sword. It was a classic, "don't mess with me" threat that backfired in a spectacular way. The over-the-mountain men were not the kind of people to take a threat like that lightly. They were a fiercely independent group of men, hunters, and farmers who were used to fending for themselves. They decided to take the fight to Ferguson before he could bring the fire and sword to their homes. They gathered their militia from North Carolina, Virginia, and what would later become Tennessee, and they marched to confront Ferguson. They were not a formal army. They were a group of men who came together for a common purpose, united by their anger and their desire for revenge. Their numbers grew as they marched, and by the time they reached Ferguson, they were a force of over 1,000 men. The two forces met on October 7th, 1780, at Kings Mountain, a small, rocky hill on the border of North and South Carolina. Ferguson, with his force of about 1,000 loyalists, had set up a defensive position on the summit of the hill, believing it to be unassailable. He was about to find out how wrong he was. The American frontiersmen, under a variety of commanders, surrounded the hill. This was not a battle of neat lines and professional military tactics. This was a battle of sharpshooters and guerrilla warfare. The Americans, using the woods and rocks for cover, launched a relentless attack on all sides. They would climb the hill, fire a volley, and then retreat back to the cover of the woods as the British and Loyalists charged down with fixed bayonets. A mainstream historical fact is that the American commanders would shout, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes," a phrase we heard before, but which was particularly apt for this type of close-quarters fighting. The British and Loyalists, trapped on the hill, were no match for the skilled American marksmen. Ferguson, who was a conspicuous target on his horse, was shot multiple times and killed. Without their leader, and with no hope of relief, the Loyalists surrendered. The battle was a short, brutal affair that lasted just over an hour. The American victory was total and overwhelming. The Loyalists suffered over 300 casualties, and the Americans captured the rest of the force. The American losses were minimal, just over 28 men killed or wounded. The Battle of Kings Mountain was a huge turning point in the Southern campaign. It was not a battle between the Continental Army and the British regulars, but it had a profound effect on the war. It completely destroyed the Loyalist militia in the region and it forced Cornwallis to change his plans. He was so unnerved by the American victory that he turned his army around and retreated back into South Carolina. The victory at Kings Mountain gave a massive boost to American morale and convinced many in the South that the British could, in fact, be defeated. It was a victory that showed the power of the American people, not just the American army, and it proved that the British strategy of relying on loyalist support was flawed. The war in the South was about to get even more complicated, and a new American commander was on his way to make sure of it. After the disaster at Camden and the moral victory at Kings Mountain, the Continental Congress, realizing it needed a new strategy for the South, sent General Nathaniel Greene to take command of the battered Southern Army. Greene was a former Quaker and a brilliant strategist, a man who understood that to win in the South, he couldn't simply face the British in open battle. His new strategy was one of attrition and maneuver. His goal was not to win every battle, but to wear down the British forces under Lord Cornwallis to make every British victory a costly one. Greene's army was small and poorly supplied, so he decided to do something a little bit risky and a little bit brilliant. He split his army in two. He sent a force under the command of General Daniel Morgan, a hard-nosed, experienced fighter, to the west to harass the British and their loyalist allies. Greene, with the main body of the army, would stay in the east, acting as a constant threat to Cornwallis and drawing his attention. It was a clever move, a sort of historical equivalent of a pincer attack, where both pincers were just annoying the enemy to death. Cornwallis, a confident and aggressive commander, took the bait. He sent a force of his best troops under the command of the young but very capable Colonel Banastre Tarleton to hunt down and destroy Morgan's force. Tarleton was a man known for his ruthless tactics and his love of a good cavalry charge. The two forces met on January 17th, 1781, at a place called Cowpens in South Carolina. Morgan, who had a much smaller force of Continental Army regulars and militia, knew that his militia might break and run under the pressure of a British bayonet charge, so he came up with a very clever plan. He placed his militia in the front line, with the Continental regulars and his cavalry hidden behind them. He told the militia to fire 2 volleys and then retreat, which was a very unusual order for a battle. The battle began just as Morgan had planned. Tarleton, seeing the militia fire their volleys and then retreat, assumed they were running away in a panic. He ordered a full British charge right into the teeth of the waiting Continental regulars. The American regulars held their ground and unleashed a devastating volley of musket fire. The British were stunned. Then, the American cavalry, led by Colonel William Washington, charged the British flank, and the militia, having reformed, returned to the battle. The British forces were completely surrounded and overwhelmed. The battle was over in less than an hour, and it was a stunning American victory. Tarleton, who had been so sure of his victory, was completely routed. He managed to escape, but he lost a significant portion of his army. The victory at Cowpens was a major turning point in the Southern campaign. It completely destroyed a key part of Cornwallis's army and forced him to abandon his plans to invade North Carolina. It was a tactical masterpiece by Daniel Morgan, a perfect example of how a smaller, less professional force could defeat a larger, better trained one with a little bit of clever thinking. It was also a huge morale boost for the Americans and a major setback for the British. Cornwallis, who had been so close to winning the war in the South, now found himself in a very difficult position. After the battle, a long, strategic chase began. Cornwallis, now more determined than ever to destroy Greene's army, pursued him and Morgan across North Carolina. Greene, in a brilliant campaign known as the Race to the Dan River, led Cornwallis on a wild goose chase, forcing the British army to march over 200 miles through the cold winter, far from their supply lines. Greene was a master of retreat, and he knew that every mile Cornwallis marched was a mile closer to his army's destruction. He was winning the war without fighting a single major battle, a truly modern and insightful approach to warfare. The stage was now set for the next big confrontation, one that would prove to be a major turning point for the British cause. After the stunning American victory at Cowpens and the long, grueling race to the Dan River, Lord Cornwallis was in a difficult position. His army was exhausted, hungry, and far from its supply lines. He had been chasing General Nathaniel Greene's army all over North Carolina, but he had failed to catch them. He knew he needed to force a decisive battle to defeat the Continental Army once and for all and end the rebellion in the South. Greene, meanwhile, had managed to get his army to a place where he could get new supplies and reinforcements, and he was now in a position where he felt confident enough to stand and fight. The two armies finally met on March 15th, 1781, at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. The battlefield was a mix of open fields and thick woods, a perfect place for Greene to use his strategic genius. He set up his army in 3 lines, a classic battle formation designed to wear down the enemy. The first line was the militia, a group of brave but inexperienced soldiers who were given the instruction to fire 2 volleys and then retreat. The second line was made up of Virginia militia, a bit more experienced and a bit more reliable. The third line, and the heart of the American army, was the Continental Regulars, the well-trained soldiers who had survived Valley Forge and the other battles. It was a clever strategy, a bit like setting up a series of historical speed bumps for the enemy. The British, under the command of Cornwallis, launched a frontal assault. They marched across the open fields in their neat, linear formations right into the teeth of the American fire. The American militia, in the first line, did exactly what they were supposed to do. They fired their 2 volleys and then retreated, causing some confusion for the British, but not stopping them. The British then pushed on to the second line, where they met the Virginia militia, who fought a bit more fiercely before they, too, were forced to retreat. It was in the third line that the battle truly began. The Continental Regulars stood their ground and fought the British professionals. The fighting was fierce and close, a chaotic melee of bayonets and muskets. The British, with their superior training, were able to push the Americans back, but they did so at a terrible price. They suffered immense casualties, losing nearly a quarter of their force, including many of their best officers and men. Cornwallis, in a desperate move, even ordered his artillery to fire into the fray, a move that killed some of his own men, but also broke the American charge. A mainstream historical fact is that Lord Cornwallis's decision to fire on his own troops at Guilford Courthouse was a testament to the desperate nature of the fighting, and it showed how close the British were to losing the battle. In the end, the British were victorious. The Americans, with their third line broken, were forced to retreat, and the British held the field. But the victory was a Pyrrhic one, a victory that cost them far more than they gained. The British army was now exhausted, decimated, and far from its supply lines. They were in no condition to continue the pursuit. Cornwallis, in a letter to a British official, wrote, "I have beaten them, but I am so weak that I cannot take advantage of the victory." It was a classic example of a strategic loss disguised as a tactical victory. After the battle, Cornwallis decided he had to change his plans. He was in no condition to continue the campaign in the Carolinas, so he abandoned his injured men and marched his army to the coast of North Carolina to get supplies and reinforcements. Greene, meanwhile, was able to retreat with his army intact, and he was able to continue the war in the Carolinas. Cornwallis's decision to march to the coast was a fatal one. It led him on a path that would eventually take him to Virginia, where he would be trapped and forced to surrender, but that's a story for another time. For now, the victory at Guilford Courthouse, while it was technically a British win, was the beginning of the end for the British Southern Campaign. The war was turning, and it was about to get a whole lot more interesting. While the American cause was finally finding its footing in the South, a shocking and disheartening event was unfolding in the North. It was a story of a man who had been one of the greatest heroes of the American Revolution, a man whose bravery and skill had been a key part of some of the most important victories, but who would become a name synonymous with treason. This was the story of Benedict Arnold, a man who, for reasons that historians still debate, decided to betray his country. Arnold was a brilliant and courageous officer, a man who had fought with distinction at the battles of Quebec and Saratoga, where his leadership had been a key factor in the American victory. But he was also a man who felt he was not getting the recognition he deserved. He was a difficult personality, a man who was often at odds with his fellow officers and with the Continental Congress. He was passed over for promotion, and he felt that his sacrifices were not being appreciated. He was also a man who had a lavish lifestyle and was constantly in debt. Arnold's frustrations grew, and in 1779 he began to correspond with the British. He offered to provide them with intelligence, and he eventually worked out a plan to betray the American cause. He requested and was given command of the American fort at West Point, a key strategic location on the Hudson River. The fort was the key to controlling the Hudson, and if the British could capture it, they would be able to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies, the very thing they had failed to do with their Saratoga campaign. Arnold's plan was simple. He would weaken the defenses of West Point, and then, at a pre-arranged time, he would surrender the fort to the British. The British would get the fort, and Arnold would get a large sum of money and a high-ranking commission in the British Army. It was a bold and audacious plan, one that, if it had succeeded, could have changed the course of the war. But the plan was discovered by a stroke of luck, or perhaps by a stroke of fate. The British officer who was acting as Arnold's go-between, Major John Andre, was captured by 3 American militiamen while he was on his way back to British lines. Andre was disguised in civilian clothes, and he was carrying incriminating documents that detailed the plot, documents that were hidden in his boot. The militiamen, who were just trying to do their duty, were a bit suspicious of Andre and decided to search him. They found the documents, and they took Andre to their commanding officer. The news of the plot was sent to Washington, who was on his way to meet with Arnold at West Point. A mainstream historical fact is that the 3 militiamen who captured Major Andre, John Paulding, Isaac Von Wart, and David Williams, were later hailed as heroes and were given pensions and land grants for their service, though historians still argue about whether they acted out of a genuine sense of duty or a desire for a reward. When Washington arrived at West Point, he was shocked and heartbroken to discover the truth. Arnold, however, managed to escape just in time, fleeing to a waiting British warship on the Hudson River. He was given a commission in the British Army and led British forces in raids against American towns in Virginia and Connecticut, becoming one of the most hated men in the new nation. Major Andre was not so lucky. He was tried as a spy and was hanged by the Americans, despite a plea for him to be shot as an officer. The treason of Benedict Arnold was a huge blow to American morale. It was a betrayal of the highest order, and it made the Americans even more determined to fight and win. It was a reminder that the war was not just a battle between 2 armies, but a war of ideologies, a war where the lines between friend and foe could be blurred. For the Americans, it was a moment of profound sadness and anger, but it was also a moment that showed them the true nature of their struggle. The war had just gotten personal. After his costly victory at Guilford Courthouse, Lord Cornwallis, in a surprising and fateful move, decided to abandon the Carolinas and march his army into Virginia. He believed that the only way to end the war in the South was to cut off the supply lines to the Carolinas and to capture Virginia, the wealthiest and most populous of the colonies. His decision was a huge strategic gamble, one that was not supported by his superior, General Henry Clinton, who wanted Cornwallis to return to Charleston and consolidate his forces. But Cornwallis, a proud and determined commander, believed that he could win the war by taking Virginia. Standing in his way was a young French nobleman with a lot of military talent and a lot of heart, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette, who had been a trusted aide to Washington and a brave commander in his own right, was given command of the American forces in Virginia. His army was small, a force of about 3,200 men, and it was no match for Cornwallis's army of over 7,000 professional soldiers. Lafayette's mission was not to defeat Cornwallis in a single battle, but to harass him, to slow him down, and to keep him from achieving his objectives. It was a mission that was a bit like trying to stop a speeding freight train with a small, very persistent dog. Lafayette proved to be a master of this kind of evasive warfare. He refused to be drawn into a decisive battle, a move that frustrated Cornwallis to no end. He used his small army to constantly shadow the British, to cut off their supply lines, and to attack their foraging parties. He moved his army from place to place, never staying in one place for too long, always a step ahead of the British. He was a brilliant young commander, and his actions in Virginia were a testament to his strategic genius. Cornwallis, for his part, was getting more and more frustrated. He tried to corner Lafayette's army, but he was never successful. He sent out a raiding party under the command of Colonel Tarleton to try to capture the Virginia legislature, including Governor Thomas Jefferson, but the American forces managed to get away just in time. The American forces, though smaller, were proving to be a constant thorn in his side. Cornwallis, who had been so successful in the early parts of the Southern campaign, was now bogged down in a frustrating game of cat and mouse. He was winning all the skirmishes, but he was not winning the war. A mainstream historical fact is that Lafayette's ability to keep his army intact and to avoid a major confrontation with Cornwallis was one of the most important parts of the Virginia campaign, and it was a crucial factor in the eventual American victory. In the summer of 1781, Cornwallis, tired of the chase and with his army in need of a rest and resupply, decided to move his army to the coast. He received orders from General Clinton to establish a fortified naval base in Virginia so that the British could have a secure port for their fleet. He chose a small town on a peninsula on the Chesapeake Bay called Yorktown. He believed that the location would be perfect for his needs. He had the Chesapeake Bay to his front and the York River to his side, and he believed that he was safe. It was a strategic decision that in hindsight was one of the biggest mistakes of the war. Lafayette, watching from a distance, saw his opportunity. He immediately sent a message to George Washington in New York and to the French Admiral de Grasse in the West Indies. His message was simple. Cornwallis was now in a trap. All they needed was a French fleet to seal off the Chesapeake Bay and an American army to close the trap on land. It was a bold idea, one that required a lot of coordination and a lot of luck. The fate of the war was now in motion, and it would all come down to a single, decisive moment. The British were about to find out that while they may have been winning the battles, they were about to lose the war. While Lord Cornwallis and the Marquis de Lafayette were playing their strategic game of cat and mouse in Virginia, a much larger game was being played on the high seas. The key to winning the war, as both Washington and the French knew, lay not just on land, but on the water. The French alliance, which had been a huge boost to the American cause, also had a new and very important benefit: the French Navy. The British, for all their land-based power, depended on the Royal Navy to move their troops and supplies and to maintain control of the American coast. A French fleet in the right place at the right time could change everything. The man in charge of the main French naval force in the West Indies was Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse. He was a brilliant commander, and he was in constant communication with General Washington and the French military leaders in America. In the summer of 1781, de Grasse received the critical message from Washington and Lafayette. Cornwallis had moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, and he was now in a vulnerable position. The time to strike was now. De Grasse made a bold and brilliant move. He sailed his entire fleet of 28 ships of the line from the West Indies to the Chesapeake Bay. It was a risky trip, as a British fleet under the command of Admiral Sir Samuel Hood was also in the area, but de Grasse was able to slip past them, arriving at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay in late August. His arrival was a complete surprise to the British, and it was a moment of immense relief for the Americans. The trap was now set. The British, however, were not about to give up. Another British fleet, under the command of Admiral Sir Thomas Graves, had just arrived from New York, and they sailed to confront de Grasse. The two fleets met on September 5th in a naval battle that would prove to be one of the most important of the entire war, the Battle of the Chesapeake, also known as the Battle of the Capes. It was a classic naval engagement, with the two fleets facing off in long lines of ships, firing their cannons at each other. The battle was a complex and confusing affair, a swirling mess of cannon smoke and splintered wood. The battle was not a decisive tactical victory for either side, but it was a massive strategic victory for the French. The British fleet, which was badly damaged, was forced to retreat back to New York. De Grasse, with his fleet now in complete control of the Chesapeake Bay, was able to establish a complete naval blockade of Yorktown. Cornwallis, who had been so confident in his position, was now trapped. He had no way to get supplies, no way to get reinforcements, and no way to escape by sea. A mainstream historical fact is that the British naval defeat at the Battle of the Chesapeake was the single most important factor in the American victory at Yorktown, and it was a prime example of the importance of French naval power in the war. Meanwhile, on land, Washington, who had been planning a feint attack on New York City, now saw his opportunity to strike the decisive blow. He and the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, began to march their combined American and French armies south from New York to Virginia. The march was a long and grueling one, but it was a secret mission, and the British in New York were completely unaware of their true destination. The combined forces would eventually number over 17,000 men, a force that was more than double the size of Cornwallis's army. The stage was now set for the final, decisive confrontation of the war. Cornwallis was trapped by land and sea, with a massive American and French army marching to his front, and a powerful French fleet blocking his escape. He had no hope of relief, and his only choices were to fight a hopeless battle or to surrender. The American and French forces began to close in on Yorktown, and the end of the war was now in sight. The war had just come to an end in the most unexpected and dramatic way possible. With the British fleet under Admiral Graves now out of the way, the trap at Yorktown was complete. George Washington and the French commander, the Comte de Rochambeau, had completed their long march from New York, and they now had a combined force of over 17,000 American and French soldiers facing a British army of about 7,000 under Lord Cornwallis. The American and French forces began to encircle the town, digging a series of trenches and fortifications that would allow them to get closer to the British defenses. It was a classic siege, and the goal was to pound the British into submission with a relentless artillery bombardment. The siege began in earnest on September 28, 1781. The American and French forces began to dig their siege lines, moving closer and closer to the British defenses. The work was slow and laborious, but it was also very effective. They worked through the night, their movements hidden by the darkness. A mainstream historical fact is that the French troops, with their superior engineering skills, were instrumental in the construction of the siege lines, and their expertise was a major factor in the speed with which the Americans and French were able to get their cannons into position. By October 9th, the Americans and French had their first line of trenches complete, and the artillery bombardment began. The British, trapped in their defenses, were now under a constant barrage of cannon fire. The sound was deafening, a relentless roar of explosions and flying metal. The British defenses were being systematically destroyed, and their morale was plummeting. Lord Cornwallis, in a letter to General Clinton, wrote that his men were at the mercy of a superior power. He was hoping for a relief force from New York, but he knew that it was unlikely to arrive in time. The Americans and French then began to dig a second line of trenches, one that would bring them even closer to the British defenses. The British had two redoubts, or small forts, that were in the way, and they had to be captured. On the night of October 14th, two simultaneous attacks were launched. The Americans, under the command of Washington's aide, Alexander Hamilton, attacked Redoubt No. 10, while the French, under the command of the Comte de Deux Ponts, attacked Redoubt No. 9. Both attacks were successful. The Americans, in a brave and daring bayonet charge, captured their redoubt in a matter of minutes, while the French took a bit longer but were just as successful. The capture of the redoubts was a key moment in the siege. It allowed the Americans and French to complete their second line of trenches and to get their cannons within a stone's throw of the main British defenses. The British were now in a hopeless position. Their defenses were in shambles, they were out of supplies, and they had no hope of relief. Cornwallis, in a last desperate attempt to escape, tried to evacuate his army across the York River, but a sudden storm blew up, scattering his boats and forcing him to abandon the plan. He had no other choice but to surrender. The time had come to end the fighting, to admit defeat, and to ask for terms. It was a moment that the Americans had been fighting for 6 long, brutal years. The war was about to come to a stunning conclusion, and the world would be watching. The final act of the American Revolution was about to be written on the fields of Yorktown, a place that would forever be known as the site of the greatest American victory. After a long and brutal siege, Lord Cornwallis, with his army decimated and his position hopeless, was finally forced to admit defeat. On October 17th, 1781, a lone British drummer boy, followed by a British officer with a white flag, appeared on the British parapet. They were signaling for a truce. The American and French forces, who had been pounding the British with a constant artillery bombardment, ceased their fire. The sound of the silence was as deafening as the sound of the cannons. It was a moment of profound significance, a moment when the reality of the British defeat finally sank in. The negotiations for the surrender began. Cornwallis, a proud and stubborn man, tried to get the best terms he could, but Washington was in no mood to be generous. The American general remembered how the British had treated the American surrender at Charleston, and he was not about to grant Cornwallis any special favors. The terms of the surrender were harsh but fair. The British and German troops were to become prisoners of war, their flags were to be cased, and they were to march out and lay down their arms. Cornwallis, claiming illness, sent his second in command, General Charles O'Hara, to lead the British forces to the surrender field. It was a deliberate snub to Washington, but the American commander was not to be outdone. He sent his own second-in-command, General Lincoln, to accept the surrender. On October 19th, 1781, a massive crowd of American and French soldiers gathered to watch the surrender. The British Army, in their bright red coats, marched out of Yorktown to the sound of a traditional British marching song, but one that was now being played in a rather somber tone. It was a humiliating moment for the most powerful army in the world. As they marched, they passed between two lines of soldiers, one American and one French, a clear sign of the new balance of power. The British troops, their heads held high but their hearts heavy, marched to a field and laid down their arms. The surrender was complete. The American and French forces had won a stunning and decisive victory. The capture of Cornwallis's army was a huge blow to the British cause, a blow from which they would never recover. The news of the victory spread like wildfire throughout the colonies, and it was met with great celebrations. It was a moment of profound joy, a moment when the American people finally knew that their independence was now a reality. A mainstream historical fact is that when the news of the British surrender reached London, the British Prime Minister, Lord North, reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it's all over." And he was right. The war was, in all practical terms, over. The victory at Yorktown was not the end of the fighting, of course. There were still British forces in New York City and in the South, and there would be a few more skirmishes and battles, but the major fighting was done. The British public, tired of the long and expensive war, was now demanding peace. The British government, now with a new prime minister, began to open peace negotiations with the Americans. The victory at Yorktown was not just a military triumph, it was a political one as well. It had given the Americans the leverage they needed to force the British to the negotiating table. The final act of the American Revolution was now about to begin, and it would be a diplomatic one. The war was won, and the hard work of building a new nation was about to begin. The final outcome had been decided, not by a single dramatic moment, but by a long and arduous struggle that had finally come to an end. The surrender at Yorktown was a monumental event, a moment that effectively ended the major fighting of the American Revolution. But the war wasn't officially over, not yet. There were still British forces in New York City, Charleston, and Savannah, and a few more skirmishes and battles would be fought in the months that followed. It was a strange period, a sort of anticlimactic wind-down after the dramatic climax at Yorktown. One could say it was like a long, slow exit after a very good movie. After the surrender of Cornwallis, the British Army in the South was still a force to be reckoned with. The British still held Charleston and Savannah, and they had a significant number of troops in the region. The American forces, under the command of General Nathaniel Greene, who had done such a brilliant job of wearing down Cornwallis, now had the task of pushing the remaining British forces out of the Carolinas and Georgia. Greene's army, though still smaller than the British forces, was now in a much stronger position. They had a massive morale boost from the victory at Yorktown, and the British were now on the defensive. The fighting in the South became a sort of mop-up operation, with the Americans laying siege to the remaining British-held towns and forts. One of the most famous of these was the Siege of 96, a small but strategically important British fort in the backcountry of South Carolina. Greene's army laid siege to the fort in May 1781, but the British defenders, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Cruger, put up a fierce resistance. The siege was a long and difficult one, and in the end, Greene was forced to abandon the siege when a British relief force under Lord Rawdon arrived. It was a tactical defeat for the Americans, but it was also a strategic victory. The British, though they had held the fort, were now so far from their main base that they decided to abandon it and move to a more secure location. The war in the South continued in this manner, a series of small, grinding actions that slowly pushed the British back to their coastal strongholds. The British, who had believed that the southern colonies were a bastion of loyalist support, were now finding out that they were very, very wrong. The patriots in the South were determined, and they were not about to give up. The war in the South became a grim and brutal affair, a war of skirmishes and raids that had a high human cost. The last major fighting took place at the Battle of Eutaw Springs in South Carolina, where the British and American armies fought a bloody but inconclusive battle. It was a hard-fought battle, but it didn't change the strategic situation. The British, with the news of Yorktown and the increasing pressure from the Americans, finally decided to evacuate their remaining forces in the South. In December 1782, they evacuated Charleston, and in July 1782, they had evacuated Savannah. The southern colonies were now free of British occupation, and the war in the South was officially over. A mainstream historical fact is that the British evacuation of their southern garrisons was not a result of any single battle, but was a strategic decision made in London, a clear signal that they had lost the will to continue the war in the American colonies. The war had just faded away in the South, not with a bang, but with a series of long, slow goodbyes. While the fighting was winding down, the real work of ending the war was taking place in Paris, where a group of American diplomats was negotiating a peace treaty. They had a difficult job, as they had to navigate the complex relationships between the United States, France, and Spain, all of whom had their own interests in the peace talks. The war was over, but the future of the new nation was still in question, and it would all come down to a signature on a piece of paper. The final outcome of the American Revolution was not decided on the battlefield, but in the halls of diplomacy. With the war effectively over on the American continent, the action shifted to a different kind of battlefield, the diplomatic one. The American cause now had a chance to gain its ultimate prize, formal recognition of its independence. The peace negotiations took place in Paris, and the American delegation was a team of remarkable men. Benjamin Franklin, with his wit and his immense diplomatic skill, was the head of the delegation. John Adams, a man of uncompromising principle and a deep understanding of the law, was a key member, and John Jay, a quiet but brilliant diplomat, was the third member. These three men had the weight of a new nation on their shoulders, and they had to navigate the complex and often treacherous world of European politics. The peace talks were complicated by the fact that the United States was allied with France, and, through France, with Spain. The French, under their foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, had a bit of a tricky position. They wanted to see the American colonies gain their independence, but they also had their own interests in mind. They wanted to weaken Great Britain, but they didn't necessarily want to see the United States become a new, powerful empire that might one day challenge French interests. The Spanish, for their part, wanted to get back some of their old territories, especially Gibraltar, and they were not so keen on the idea of a new American nation that might expand into their territory in the West. It was a bit like trying to get three friends to agree on a movie, only the movie was the future of the world. The American delegation, however, had one huge advantage. They were not playing for a piece of the pie, they were playing for the whole pie. They knew that their leverage came from the British desire to end the war, and they knew that the British wanted to split the American-French alliance. The Americans, in a bold move, decided to negotiate with the British separately, a violation of their treaty with France, but a move that they believed was in their best interest. A mainstream historical fact is that the American decision to negotiate a separate peace with Great Britain was a source of great tension with the French, and it was a diplomatic gamble that paid off for the Americans. The negotiations were long and arduous, and there were a number of sticking points. The British, for example, were very concerned about the treatment of the Loyalists, the Americans who had remained loyal to the Crown. They wanted to make sure that the Loyalists were not persecuted and that their property was returned to them. The Americans, for their part, were not so keen on this idea, and they were also very concerned about getting fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, something that was a key part of the New England economy. Another major sticking point was the western boundary of the new nation. The British wanted the boundary to be the Appalachian Mountains, which would have confined the United States to a small strip of land on the coast. The Americans, however, demanded that the boundary be the Mississippi River, a claim that was, in a sense, a bit audacious. John Jay, the American diplomat, was a master at this part of the negotiation. He convinced the British that it was in their best interest to give the Americans the western lands, as it would create a new nation that might one day be an ally against their old rivals, the Spanish and the French. It was a brilliant move, a piece of strategic thinking that would change the map of North America forever. The British, who were tired of the war and who were a bit worried about the other European powers, finally agreed to the American demands. The peace treaty was about to be signed, and the American dream was about to become a reality. After months of tense negotiations in Paris, the American, British, and French delegations were finally able to come to an agreement. On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was officially signed, formally ending the American Revolutionary War. It was a momentous occasion, a moment when the dream of a new nation became a reality. The treaty was a masterpiece of diplomacy, and it gave the Americans almost everything they could have hoped for, a testament to the skill and the resolve of the American diplomats. The terms of the treaty were, in many ways, a stunning victory for the United States. First and most importantly, Great Britain formally recognized the United States as a sovereign and independent nation. This was the ultimate prize, the reason the war was fought in the first place, and it was a moment of immense satisfaction for the American people. Second, the treaty established the new nation's boundaries. The United States was granted a vast amount of territory, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to Spanish Florida. This was a massive gain, a huge expansion that was a testament to the diplomatic genius of the American delegation. It gave the new nation a massive amount of land for future expansion and ensured that it would be a major power on the North American continent. The treaty also had a few other important provisions. It granted Americans fishing rights off the coast of Newfoundland, a key part of the New England economy. It also called for the evacuation of all British troops from American soil, something that would take a little bit of time to complete. The treaty also had a few provisions that were a little bit more difficult for the Americans to swallow. The Americans agreed to recommend to the state legislatures that the property of the Loyalists, the Americans who had remained loyal to the British Crown, should be returned to them, a provision that was largely ignored by the states. And the Americans also agreed to pay back all pre-war debts that they owed to British merchants, something that would also prove to be a difficult and contentious issue in the years to come. But these were small prices to pay for the immense gains that were made. The Treaty of Paris was a stunning success for the United States, and it was a moment that showed the world that a new kind of government, one based on the idea of popular sovereignty, could be successful. It was also a moment of immense humiliation for Great Britain. They had lost the war, they had lost their most valuable colonies, and they had been forced to recognize a new nation that they had once called a bunch of rebellious farmers. The news of the treaty was met with great joy in the United States. It meant that the long and bloody war was finally over, and it meant that the American people could now turn their attention to the hard work of building a new government and a new society. Meanwhile, there was still the matter of the British forces still occupying American cities. The treaty had called for their evacuation, and it was now a matter of when and how. The American army, which had been waiting for this moment, was now ready to take back its cities. The final act of the American Revolution was not a battle, but a march. It was a moment of quiet dignity, a final farewell to an old way of life, and a welcome to a new one. A mainstream historical fact is that the signing of the Treaty of Paris was a moment of great celebration in the United States, but it was also a moment that was marked by a sense of uncertainty and trepidation about the future. The war was won, but the hard work of building a new nation was just beginning. The new nation was free, but it was also broke, and it was about to face a new set of challenges that would be just as difficult as the war itself. Even after the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the war's conclusion was not a sudden event, but a slow, unfolding process. While the diplomats were celebrating in France, there were still British forces occupying several major American cities. The last major British garrison in the United States was in New York City, and the final evacuation was a moment of immense symbolism and a culmination of all the years of fighting. The British had held New York for over 7 years, and its return to American hands was the final, tangible sign that the revolution had been successful. It was a day that the American people had been waiting for with bated breath. The final evacuation of New York City took place on November 25th, 1783, a day that came to be known as Evacuation Day. The morning was cold and crisp, a fitting backdrop for such a solemn and important occasion. The British forces, under the command of General Sir Guy Carleton, began their withdrawal from the city. They marched in a long, silent column to the docks, where they boarded their ships and sailed away. The Royal Navy, which had been the source of so much pain and suffering for the American cause, was now leaving for good. As the last of the British ships sailed out of the harbor, a new American flag, the Stars and Stripes, was raised over the city. George Washington, who had been waiting patiently just outside the city, was now ready to lead his army in a triumphant march into New York. It was a moment of great personal satisfaction for the commander, a moment that must have felt like a dream after all the years of fighting and suffering. His army, a force that had been on the verge of collapse so many times, was now marching into the city, a victorious army, not a defeated one. The American forces, a mix of Continental regulars and local militia, marched down Broadway, with Washington at their head. The streets were filled with cheering crowds, and the atmosphere was one of immense joy and relief. It was a moment that the people of New York, who had suffered for so long under British occupation, would never forget. After his triumphant entry into New York, Washington had one more important task to complete. On December 4th, at Fraunces Tavern in New York City, he met with his officers and delivered a farewell address. It was a tearful and emotional moment. He thanked his men for their service, and he praised them for their courage and their resilience. He then resigned his commission as commander-in-chief and returned to his home at Mount Vernon, a man who had done his duty and was now ready to return to his life as a farmer. It was a stunning act, a moment that was almost unprecedented in the history of the world. A man who had so much power, a man who could have easily become a king or a dictator, chose to give it all up and return to a life of quiet anonymity. A mainstream historical fact is that George Washington's decision to voluntarily relinquish his military command was one of the most important moments in the founding of the new republic, and it set a powerful precedent for the idea of a government that was accountable to the people and not to a single, powerful leader. It was a moment that showed the world that the American Revolution was not just about winning a war, but about building a new kind of society, one that was based on the idea of liberty and a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. The war had finally, truly come to an end. The last British forces had left, the American army had been disbanded, and the new nation was now on its own. The fighting was over, but the work of building a new government, a new economy, and a new society was just beginning. It was a moment of immense promise, but also a moment of immense uncertainty. The new nation was free, but it was also a bit lost, and it would now have to find its own way in the world. With the final British evacuation and the disbandment of the Continental Army, the United States was finally, truly on its own. The war had been won, but the work of building a nation was just beginning, and it was a task that was, in many ways, just as difficult as the war itself. The new country faced a host of problems, from a massive national debt to a weak central government that was barely holding the states together. The Articles of Confederation, the first form of government, were a bit like a group project where no one was really in charge, and it was quickly becoming clear that they were not strong enough to solve the nation's problems. The economy was a mess. The long war had disrupted trade, and the country was broke. The states, which were now sovereign entities, were feuding with each other over trade and territory. The central government had no power to tax, so it had no way to pay off its debts, and it had no way to raise an army to defend the country. A mainstream historical fact is that the United States, in the years after the Revolution, was so broke that it couldn't even pay its soldiers, a problem that led to a great deal of frustration and even a few small-scale rebellions. It was a time of immense uncertainty, and many people, both in America and in Europe, believed that the new nation would not survive. But the American people, who had just fought and won a war for their independence, were not about to give up. They had a new and powerful idea, a new way of thinking about government. They believed that a government should be based on the will of the people and not on the will of a king. They knew that to survive, they would have to create a new form of government, one that was strong enough to unite the states, but not so strong that it would become a tyranny. It was a delicate balance, and it was a problem that they would have to solve themselves. The solution came in 1787, when a group of delegates from the states met in Philadelphia to create a new constitution. The Constitutional Convention was a long and difficult process, filled with debates and compromises. The delegates, a mix of brilliant thinkers and pragmatic politicians, had to find a way to balance the power of the states with the power of the central government to protect the rights of the individual while also ensuring the stability of the nation. It was a historic moment, and the result was a document that would become the law of the land, a document that would set the course for the new nation for centuries to come. The Constitution created a new form of government, a federal republic with a strong central government that was divided into three branches: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. It gave the government the power to tax, to raise an army, and to regulate trade. It also created a system of checks and balances that was designed to prevent any one part of the government from becoming too powerful. The Constitution was a revolutionary document, a testament to the idea that a government could be created by the people and for the people. The Constitution, of course, was not a perfect document. It had its flaws, most notably its acceptance of slavery, but it was a huge step forward, a massive improvement over the Articles of Confederation, and it was a sign that the American people were not just a bunch of rebellious farmers, but a people who were capable of self-governance. It was a long road from the first shots at Lexington and Concord to the final signing of the Treaty of Paris, but the American people had done it. They had won their independence, and they had created a new form of government, a government that was a beacon of hope for people all over the world. The legacy of the American Revolution was not just about winning a war, but about building a new nation, a nation that would one day be a global superpower, but which for now was just a small, struggling republic. The final British forces had departed American shores. The peace treaty was signed and ratified, and a new constitution was in place. The American Revolution, which began with a few tense moments on a village green, had finally concluded. But the end of the war was not the end of the story. The legacy of the conflict would shape the new nation for generations to come, and the stories of the men and women who fought it would sink into the legends of a new country. There was no single grand finale, no final sweeping battle to tie a ribbon on the whole affair. The war simply faded as seasons change, leaving a vast, quiet space for a new world to grow. The United States was now a sovereign nation, but it was a fragile one. It was a collection of 13 states, each with its own interests, and a central government that was still a bit unsure of itself. The men who had been heroes of the Revolution were now trying to be statesmen, and the transition was not always a smooth one. George Washington, the hero of the war, was now the first president, a job that was, in many ways, just as difficult as leading an army. He had to navigate a host of new problems, from a massive national debt to a political system that was quickly becoming divided into different factions. The new nation was free, but it was also a little bit lost. A teenager leaving home for the first time, full of ambition but lacking a clear roadmap. The legacy of the war, however, was immense. It had changed the world. It had shown that a colony could fight for its independence and win, a powerful idea that would inspire revolutions all over the world in the centuries to come. It had also created a new kind of government, one based on the idea of popular sovereignty and individual rights. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were not just pieces of paper. They were a new philosophy of governance, a new way of thinking about the relationship between a government and its people. A mainstream historical fact is that the American Revolution and the ideas it produced had a profound and lasting impact on political thought and on the course of human history. But the war also left a few questions unanswered, a few ghosts lingering in the quiet corners of the new republic. The most painful of these was the issue of slavery. The war, which had been fought for the ideals of liberty and equality, had not ended slavery, and the new nation was now left with a fundamental contradiction at its heart. Historians still argue whether the American Revolution was a revolution that went far enough, or whether it was a revolution that was in many ways an unfinished project. The question of liberty and equality for all would not be settled for another century, and it would take another war to finally put an end to the institution of slavery. And so, the story of the American Revolution is not just a story of battles and generals, of victories and defeats. It is also a story of a new nation, a nation that was born out of a long and bloody struggle, and which would have to spend the rest of its life grappling with the very ideas that had brought it into being. The war had ended, and the men who had fought it were now gone, their stories now just a faint echo in the long halls of history. And so their journey from the quiet villages of New England to the sun-baked fields of Virginia slowly came to a close. The Great War, with its roar of cannons and the quiet march of weary feet, faded into memory. The soldiers, the farmers, and the statesmen, their work done, returned to their homes, to their families, to a life that was now forever changed. The world was now a bit different than it was before, a bit quieter perhaps, but also a bit more free. And as the sun set on a new nation, the new republic, with all its hopes and all its flaws, began its long and very uncertain walk into the future, a long and weary walk that continues to this very day. So rest now. Your journey is done. The battles are over. The heroes have come home.